The bell above the door of Harlem Corner Diner chimed softly, a fragile sound that almost disappeared against the night roar of New York City. Outside, car horns tangled with sirens, and the river of headlights stretched endlessly up Lenox Avenue. However, time felt strangely still, as if the air was thickened by grease perfume and quiet longing. It was the kind of diner that had lived 1,000 lives already. Red vinyl booths cracked at the seams, napkin dispensers polished more by habit than by cleanliness, and a faint jazz track playing from a jukebox that rarely worked. To most, it was a cheap refuge. To Alexander Whitmore, it was a ritual. Once a month he came here, slipping away from glass towers and boardrooms that bent the city to his will. To anyone watching, he was just another man in a tailored charcoal suit, hair silvered at the temples, face unreadable. But to those who read the financial press, his name was legend. Whitmore Global Holdings wasn't just a company. It was an empire he had built, brick by cold brick. He was power in its most distilled form, a man whose decisions could sway economies. Yet here he sat alone, staring at eggs, grown cold, with the look of someone who had once had everything but misplaced the reason for it. His wife had loved places like this. Isabella. She had called them full of character. He had called them inefficient. Since her passing, his visits to the diner were less about nostalgia and more about enduring a peculiar emptiness, as if he could summon her ghost by sitting in the booth she once smiled across. Tonight, like every visit, he told himself it would be the last. And then he saw her. Naomi Carter moved between tables, with the effortless rhythm of someone carrying other people's burdens for too long. Her uniform was modest, a pale blue dress apron tied at the waist, the fabric worn thin from countless washings. She was young, yet exhaustion left faint shadows beneath her eyes, like bruises life had painted there. But her steady, graceful, deliberate movements betrayed a strength that intrigued him. She was not dazzling in the shallow way most women orbiting his world were, no glittering jewels, rehearsed laughter, or perfume crafted by Parisian chemists. Naomi had something rarer: authenticity, a smile that appeared only when meant, a voice that soothed without effort. Alexander did not know why his gaze kept following her. Perhaps it was how she bent to reassure an older woman about her toast, or the soft patience she offered a child who spilled his drink. It was simply that he had grown used to a world where kindness was a currency no one could afford. Whatever it was, he studied her the way he once studied acquisitions, evaluating, searching for the hidden value beneath the surface. Naomi, for her part, noticed nothing. She carried with her 1,000 silent calculations, rent due Friday, the transmission in her second-hand car, coughing its death rattle, her brother's prescription waiting at the pharmacy. Marcus, 10 years old, her universe. His lungs ravaged by cystic fibrosis were her clock, her battle, her reason to rise before dawn and work until her bones ached. Every smile she offered a stranger was in truth a prayer that it might buy him another week, another treatment, another breath. And then, just as life has a habit of doing, the fragile balance was shattered. The diner door slammed open, the bell clanging with violence this time. 2 men rushed inside. One wore a ski mask, the other a hood pulled low. The first carried a pistol trembling in his hands like it weighed 100 pounds. "Everybody down. Empty the register," the masked man barked, voice cracking under the strain of panic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks clattered to plates. A silence, thick and acidic, swallowed the diner. Alexander Whitmore's instincts, honed by decades of hostile takeovers and boardroom wars, surged. His body tensed. His mind assessed 2 assailants, one weapon shaky grip, amateur. Primary motivation, cash, not blood. He slipped a hand toward his phone, ready to trigger the silent alarm wired to his private security detail. And yet, he paused. because what happened next was not in his calculations. Naomi did not scream. She did not collapse or cower. Instead, she gently set down the plates in her hands, the porcelain clinking louder than gunfire in that terrible stillness. Slowly, she raised her palms open, a gesture of peace. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice a steady current in a river of fear. "Everyone stay calm. He wants the money." The gunman's wild eyes flicked toward her, but her gaze did not waver. She looked at him, not with fear or judgment, but with something almost unimaginable. Compassion. She saw not a monster, but a man cornered by his mistakes. An older woman began to sob uncontrollably. The gunman snapped his pistol, jerking toward her. Shut her up, or I'll—" Brenda Naomi's voice cut through, calm but firm, never leaving the gunman's eyes. "It's me, Naomi. Look at me. Breathe with me, in and out. It'll be over in a minute. Just breathe." Alexander watched, transfixed. He had seen CEOs crumble under the pressure of a single hostile question, politicians sweat under bright lights. But here in this humble diner, a waitress was orchestrating the emotional temperature of the room, with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. She de-escalated the chaos, not with force, but with presence. And the room obeyed her. The second thief stuffed a bag with cash, urging his partner to flee. The gunman's eyes locked with Naomi's one last time, and in that brief, suspended heartbeat, something flickered there. Confusion, shame, perhaps even relief before he bolted. The door banged shut. The sirens outside wailed in the distance. The air cracked open with sobs and gasps of relief. Naomi moved first. She comforted the crying, fetched water, and checked on the shaken. Her hands were steady, her words soft. She was the center of gravity, pulling broken pieces back together. And Alexander Whitmore did not move at all. He sat frozen, not from fear, but from awe. What he had just witnessed was not luck. It was not bravado. It was grace under fire, a quality rarer than diamonds, more valuable than any acquisition he had ever made. For the first time in years, Alexander felt his pulse quicken, not from numbers on a stock ticker, but from the quiet power of a stranger's courage. And though he could hardly admit it to himself, from something even more dangerous attraction. There, in the lingering tremor of crisis, their eyes met. She glanced toward his booth only briefly, as if checking that he was unharmed. Yet in that fleeting contact, he felt a jolt like a match struck in darkness. It was absurd, impossible. He was a billionaire. She was a waitress, worlds apart. And yet the human heart is no respecter of balance sheets. When the police finally arrived, the scene dissolved into procedures, questions, and statements. Naomi's exhaustion weighed heavily now that adrenaline was fading, but she continued her work. When she finally reached Alexander's table, her hand trembled slightly as she placed the check down. "I'm so sorry for what happened, sir," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse but still calm. "Your meal is on the house." He looked at her then, not as a customer or a billionaire evaluating a prospect, but truly looked. At the frayed seams of her uniform, the lavender shadows beneath her eyes, the resilience stitched into her every gesture. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick fold of bills. $100 notes. $2,000. He placed them on the table and slid his stark white business card beneath. "That wasn't fearlessness," he said quietly, his voice low and rough from disuse. "That was management. Very impressive." Before she could respond, he rose and left the money, the card, and a storm in Naomi's heart. She stared at the pile of bills, stunned. To her, it wasn't just money. It was medicine, rent, breathing space. But the card, that was something else entirely. Alexander Whitmore. Whitmore Global Holdings, and a private number. Why? The question gnawed at her as she cleaned tables home through the neon night and counted the bills again at her kitchen table beside her brother's breathing machine. Why would a man like that notice her? Why did his words replay in her head, deeper than gratitude, heavier than chance? And why did her heart beat faster when she thought of his eyes, cold gray, unreadable, as though it recognized something she could not name? Naomi Carter did not sleep that night. The city hummed through her thin apartment walls, but it wasn't the sirens or the restless footsteps on the stairs that kept her awake. It was the small white rectangle resting on her kitchen table. Alexander Whitmore. His name alone seemed to carry weight, as if the paper itself were heavier than it looked. She had counted the money 3 times already. $2,000. Crisp bills that smelled faintly of leather and smoke. To someone else, it might have been a generous tip. To Naomi, it was survival rent. Marcus's medication a reprieve from the gnawing anxiety that never left her chest. And yet it wasn't the money that unsettled her. It was the card. She sat at the table, her chin resting in her hands, staring at the bold black letters. They felt like a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Behind that door might be opportunity or ruin. Her brother Marcus stirred in his bedroom, coughing softly before the hum of his nebulizer steadied him back to sleep. Naomi rose and peeked in her heart, softening at seeing his small frame curled beneath blankets. He was only 10, his body frail, his hair a messy crown of curls against the pillow. Beside him lay a battered copy of The Little Prince pages, worn from her reading it aloud on nights when his lungs ached too much for him to speak. She closed the door gently and leaned against the wall card pressed to her chest. What kind of man gives away money like that? What kind of man looks at a server in the middle of a holdup and sees what exactly? Courage strategy or something else? The question burned through her. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when exhaustion finally dragged her toward sleep, she dreamed not of robbers or guns, but of a man's gray eyes watching her as though she were the only steady point in a collapsing world. For 3 days, the card haunted her. At the diner, Beth, the other waitress, frazzled and curious, caught her staring at it, tucked inside her apron pocket. Naomi Beth whispered wide-eyed, "Is it true? He left you $2,000? Who was he?" Naomi shook her head, brushing past, unwilling to explain. How could she? How could she tell anyone that the billionaire of headlines had sat in her section had left not just money, but a piece of himself behind? She tried to ignore it and bury herself in work. But each time she filled a coffee cup or scribbled an order, she felt the stiff edge of the card against her hip. It was like carrying a live coal, small but unrelenting. At night, she searched for his name on her old laptop. The results spilled across the screen. The Titan of Manhattan, the Velvet Hammer, the man who owned skylines. Photographs of him in tailored suits, stepping out of black cars, standing beside glass towers that scraped the sky, always composed, always severe. And yet none of those photographs captured the man she had seen in the diner, the one who for a moment had looked at her as if she were rewriting the rules of his world. By the 4th night, her resolve broke. She sat at the kitchen table again, Marcus coloring silently across from her. He glanced up and noticed the card between her fingers. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice thin from treatment. "Just someone from work," she lied. Marcus frowned, his 2 wise eyes studying her. "He's essential, isn't he? You keep staring at it like it's magic." Naomi exhaled a shaky laugh. "Magic isn't real, baby. But maybe chances are," he said. Then he pushed the card toward her. Call him. He could help. She wanted to argue to protect him from disappointment, but Marcus's gaze carried the same quiet faith that had gotten them this far. She realized she wasn't just afraid of what might happen if she called. She was scared of what might happen if she didn't. So with trembling hands, Naomi picked up her phone. The number rang only once. Whitmore, a voice answered. Deep, unmistakable. Her throat closed. She had expected a receptionist, a machine, some barrier between her world and his. But it was him. Hello, Mr. Whitmore. She managed her voice barely above a whisper. This is Naomi Carter, from the diner the other night. There was silence long enough that she wondered if he had hung up. Then I know who you are. The words were steady, without hesitation. They slid down her spine like a current. She faltered. I wanted to thank you for what you left behind. Another pause. She could almost hear him thinking. I wasn't buying gratitude, he said finally. I was waiting for your call. Her pulse stumbled. Waiting. I don't make gestures without intent. Ms. Carter, I judged you to be decisive. 4 days is not decisive. It's hesitant. Naomi's jaw tightened. 4 days is practical. I had to think of my family before dialing a stranger's number. A sound came through the line, low, almost like the ghost of a chuckle. It startled her. Could Alexander Whitmore laugh? Fair enough, he said. Whitmore Plaza. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Don't be late. And then the line went dead. Naomi stared at the phone, her heart thundering. She had expected. What gratitude, perhaps? Polite dismissal. Not this. Not an order delivered as though he already knew she would obey. She should have been angry at his arrogance. She should have tossed the card into the trash and returned to her life. But beneath her indignation throbbed something more dangerous. Curiosity. A pull she couldn't explain, as though unseen fingers had plucked the strings of her life and now hummed in his key. That night she couldn't sleep again, but for different reasons. She stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing what she would say, how she would sit, what she would wear. Nothing in her closet seemed right. How could polyester and thrift store blouses stand against marble floors and men in bespoke suits? Finally, she chose one good outfit, a black skirt and a white blouse that was ironed until the fabric almost gleamed. It wasn't designed, but it was neat and hers. She laid it out carefully, her hands trembling over the buttons. In the quiet that followed, she allowed herself one forbidden thought. What if this meeting were not just about business? What if his eyes in the diner had seen her composure, and the idea was absurd. But still she fell asleep with its whisper curling around her heart. The next morning, Naomi stood before Whitmore Plaza, a towering monolith of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the clouds. Its black surface reflected the sky like a mirror, cold and unyielding. People streamed past in tailored suits, heels clicking against marble voices, crisp with purpose. Naomi felt like a trespasser. Her skirt and blouse, though carefully pressed, felt almost laughable in this world of silk ties and briefcases. But she held her head high, clutched her small purse, and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was cathedral-like, its ceilings soaring, its marble floors polished until they shone. Security guards watched with detached precision. A receptionist with a headset greeted her with a practiced smile, directing her to the express elevator. As the doors closed, Naomi caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. She looked like herself, but not. She looked like someone stepping into a story that wasn't hers to tell. The elevator ascended swiftly, her ears popping. Floor numbers flashed past, 40, 70, finally 92. When the doors opened, silence rushed in. This was not the chaotic hum of the city below. This was power distilled into quiet. The air itself smelled expensive, faintly of leather and lemon. A pair of frosted glass doors loomed ahead. Behind them waited Alexander Whitmore. Her pulse hammered, but she forced her steps steady. Each click of her heels on the polished floor sounded like a drumbeat in her ears. A receptionist gestured her forward. The doors opened with a hush, revealing an office that was less a workplace and more a kingdom. One wall was nothing but glass framing the city in sprawling miniature. The furniture was sparse with sharp lines of mahogany and chrome. And there by the window stood the man himself. He didn't turn immediately. He looked down at the city as if it were his to command. When he finally did face her, the morning light carved his features into something sculpted, almost mythic. His silvered hair caught the sun, his gray eyes unreadable. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was the same as on the phone, deep, measured, carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "You're punctual, a good sign." Naomi's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. "You asked me to come." "I did." He gestured toward the chair opposite his massive desk. "Please sit." She obeyed, perched on the edge of the leather seat, her back straight. He studied her with the calm intensity of a man appraising, not just a person, but an investment. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Naomi felt it in her chest, a tension both sharp and electric. Finally, he spoke. The $2,000 was not charity. It was a thank you for the most interesting 10 minutes I've seen in years. Her lips parted in surprise. "Interesting. That was a robbery. And yet you managed it better than most executives manage a boardroom," he replied. His gaze did not waver. "You didn't panic. You assessed. You de-escalated. You controlled the environment. That is a rare skill, Ms. Carter. One I find valuable." Naomi's pulse fluttered. His words were clinical, precise. Yet beneath them, she thought she heard something else. Admiration. Curiosity. Maybe even fascination. "You think I'm some manager?" she asked, her voice tight. "I'm a waitress." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Titles mean little. I can teach anyone to read a balance sheet. I cannot teach what you did in that diner." How he said it, calm assured as though the matter were already decided, sent a shiver down her spine. And though she tried to steady her breath, Naomi Carter could not ignore the truth blooming quietly inside her. She had stepped into Whitmore Plaza, prepared for intimidation, maybe even mockery. She hadn't prepared for the possibility that beneath Alexander Whitmore's steel exterior, there might be the faint, flickering beginnings of something else, something dangerously close to desire. The following morning, Naomi stood before the vast window on the 92nd floor, the city spread out beneath her like a restless ocean. She had never seen New York from this height before. From here, even the chaos of Harlem seemed softened, as though distance and glass could tame the noise. But no distance could soften the tension in her chest. She clasped her hands before her, steadying them, when the low timbre of Alexander's voice broke through the silence. "Miss Carter," he said, not lifting his gaze from the tablet in his hands. "Do you know why you're here?" Naomi swallowed. "Because I called." Finally, he looked up, his gray eyes catching hers with quiet force. "Because you proved something in that diner. Now I intend to see if it was chance, or if it is who you are." Her pulse fluttered. "And how will you know?" A small pause. "Then I will give you a problem. Solve it." He rose from his chair, moving to the window. With his hands clasped behind his back, he looked like a man surveying a kingdom. Sterling Tower, our flagship development downtown. 80 stories of glass and steel. It will redefine the skyline. However, one tenant refused to leave the last building, which we must clear. Eleanor Brooks, 78, former schoolteacher. She has ignored every offer. My executives call it impossible. He turned, pinning her with his gaze. You will go to her. You will succeed where they failed. Naomi stared stunned. Me? I'm not a negotiator. I don't know contracts or... He cut her off, his tone quiet but firm. You know people. That is rarer than knowing contracts. Go. The assignment pressed against her ribs like a weight as she left Whitmore Plaza. She wanted to protest, to insist he had chosen the wrong person. But beneath her panic ran something warmer, stranger. He trusted her. Alexander Whitmore, the man who commanded skylines, trusted her. It was absurd. And yet when she remembered the way he had said, "You know people," her doubts softened like ice under sunlight. That afternoon, Naomi walked to a modest tenement between construction fences and towering cranes. The old brick building seemed out of place amid the rising steel giants. But its windows were polished, and small flower boxes lined the sills filled with late summer blooms. Naomi took a deep breath, clutching the paper bag in her hand. She had stopped at a bakery on the way, a gamble, but she remembered a note buried in the archives she had spent hours combing through. Eleanor Brooks had once won a neighborhood pie contest with her apple tart. She knocked. The door revealed a small woman with white hair and eyes sharp as polished glass. She looked Naomi up and down, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "If you're from Whitmore, you can turn around," Eleanor said crisply. Naomi steadied her voice. "My name is Naomi Carter. I'm not here to give you another offer. I just wanted to talk." She lifted the bag. "I brought something, an apple tart. I heard you were an expert." The older woman's sternness cracked just slightly. She hesitated, then sighed. "Well, it would be a shame to waste it. Come in." The apartment was filled with books stacked on every surface, photographs in worn frames, and the faint smell of lavender. Naomi sat across from Eleanor at a small kitchen table, the tart between them. For a while they spoke of small things, the flowers in the window boxes, the neighborhood before the cranes arrived. Slowly, Naomi steered the conversation to Eleanor herself, her years as a teacher, her late husband, and the students she had touched. Finally, Eleanor's eyes softened as they lingered on a photograph of a man in a firefighter's uniform. "Robert laid every brick in that fireplace with his own hands," she said quietly. "My son took his first steps right there. This isn't just walls. It's a lifetime." Naomi nodded, her voice gentle. "You're not afraid of losing a building. You're so scared of losing your memories." Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes. "Exactly." Naomi leaned forward. What if those memories didn't have to vanish? What if they could live on publicly, permanently? What if every child in this city knew Robert's name? Every young reader was guided by your legacy. From her bag, Naomi slid out a proposal she had typed herself late the night before, fueled by instinct and desperation. "Sterling Tower will have a public plaza. We propose dedicating it as the Robert and Eleanor Brooks Memorial Garden. Your rose bush will be its centerpiece. A bronze plaque will honor Robert's service. We will establish the Brooks Literacy Fund, which donates books to inner-city schools yearly in your name." Eleanor's breath caught. Her gaze flicked from Naomi's earnest face to the papers before her. Slowly, her hand trembled to her mouth. "You would do that?" Naomi's voice was steady. "Not me. Whitmore. But I'll make sure of it." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then softly, "I'll sign." 2 days later, Naomi stood once more before Alexander's desk. He skimmed the signed agreement, his face unreadable. Chase Montgomery sat nearby, his jaw tight with anger, his polished suit a brittle armor for his bruised pride. Finally, Alexander set the papers down. Effective. Naomi's breath released in a rush. She hadn't realized she was holding. Chase, however, could not contain himself. "This is sentimental nonsense," he snapped. You let her bribe an older woman with flattery and a plaque. It's a weakness. Alexander's gaze cut to him cold and sharp. It's a victory. Chase fell silent, seething. Alexander turned back to Naomi, and for the first time he smiled. Not the cruel curve she had seen in photographs, but something small, almost reluctant, softening the edges of his face. "Well done, Miss Carter," he said. His tone was quiet, but the words wrapped around her like warmth. Naomi's chest tightened, heat rising to her cheeks. For a moment, the room dissolved, the skyscrapers, the contracts, even Chase's bitter glare. There was only his gaze, steady and piercing, holding hers, as though he could see beneath her skin. And in that silent exchange, Naomi realized something terrifying. She wanted him to see her. Not just her skills, not just her solutions, her. That night, Naomi lay awake in her apartment again, Marcus breathing softly in the next room. The city lights flickered through the blinds, but her thoughts were miles away, high in a glass tower, where a man with silver hair had smiled at her as if she were more than a waitress, more than a fleeting miracle in a diner. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart thundering beneath her palm. She should not feel this. He was her employer. He was a billionaire. He lived in a world untouchable, unyielding. And yet, against every defense she had built, something had begun. Something quiet. Something dangerous. Something like love. The morning after the Brooks Agreement was finalized, the air inside Whitmore Plaza carried a current Naomi could feel in her skin. She walked past glass walls and marble floors, the whispers of executives trailing in her wake. A waitress, they still murmured. A fluke, a stunt. She kept her chin high, but her heart pounded all the same. She had solved her first test. And yet something in Alexander's eyes when he told her well done lingered with a weight she couldn't ignore. It hadn't just been approval. It had been recognition, as though he had seen more than her solution. He had seen her. She clung to that memory as she entered his office the next morning. He stood again by the vast window, his back to her, the city beneath his gaze like a captive empire. His voice was low when he spoke. Sterling Tower was a small storm. "Let's see how you handle a hurricane." Naomi's pulse stuttered. "There's a union matter," he continued. "We acquired a port facility last year. Operations have stalled. The union refuses automation. Their leader, Tony Russo, has chewed through 2 of my best lawyers. He believes fear keeps him strong. I want you to meet him. Negotiate. Resolve it." Naomi blinked. "Mr. Whitmore? I'm not a—" His head turned, and his eyes silenced her. Gray, unwavering, sharp, with quiet intensity. "You are exactly who he needs to meet," he said. "Not another lawyer, not another man in a suit. Someone who sees people where others see obstacles. Please do it." Her breath caught. His trust both terrified and ignited her. She wanted to ask, "Why me?" But the words dissolved on her tongue. Instead, she nodded. Yes, the dock smelled of brine and rust, the sea lapping against pilings like an endless heartbeat. Naomi tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders as gulls wheeled overhead. The tavern Alexander's notes had led her to was dim lit by the glow of neon beer signs. Inside, Tony Russo sat hunched over a chipped table, a bear of a man, his shoulders thick, his hands like granite blocks. His eyes were hard as stones when he glanced up, taking her in. "Whitmore sent you," he growled. "He's getting soft." Naomi slid into the seat across from him, steadying her hands. "He didn't send a lawyer this time. He sent a problem solver." Tony barked a laugh, humorless. "And what's a waitress supposed to solve? Bring me coffee while they replace my men with machines." Naomi's pulse jumped, but she leaned forward, refusing to flinch. "I read your file, and your father's, and your grandfather's. 3 generations built this union. Your men are your bloodline. I know what you're afraid of, Tony, not losing jobs, losing legacy. His eyes narrowed, a spark flickering. She continued, voice steady. You're right. Automation is coming. No one can stop it. But what if your men weren't erased by it? What if they were elevated? Whitmore Holdings will fund a training center right here at the port. Every single member retrained to service and manage the new systems. Higher skills, higher pay. Your union won't be fighting the future, Tony. You'll be running it. Silence. The tavern hummed faintly with a jukebox in the corner, the scent of fried fish heavy in the air. Russo's thick fingers tapped against the table. His jaw tightened. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, gruffer. Can you buy me with promises? Naomi met his stare. I can honor you with vision. Something shifted in his expression, just a crack. But it was enough. The old lion of the docks leaned back, crossing his arms. You've got guts, he muttered. I'll give you that. Please send me the papers. I'll sign. 2 days later, the agreement was sealed. Whitmore's port facility roared to life, the first machines arriving alongside men already signed up for training. And Naomi found herself once more in Alexander's office, sliding the documents across his desk. Chase Montgomery sat in the corner, his smile a brittle blade, his eyes sharp with contempt. Unbelievable, he sneered. You gave away millions in training to keep some dock rats happy. It's lunacy. Alexander didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on Naomi, calm, but burning with something she couldn't name. Not lunacy, he said. Strategy. Chase's protest died on his tongue. He stormed from the room, but neither Naomi nor Alexander followed him with their gaze. The space between them was heavy charged. Alexander rose, coming around the desk, his steps deliberate. He stopped only a breath away, close enough that Naomi felt the quiet force of his presence. You stood before a man who thrives on fear, he said softly, and you disarmed him with vision. That is not taught in any school. That is instinct. Naomi's heart raced. I only did what I thought was right. His lips curved, barely a smile, more like the shadow of one. And that is why it worked. For a moment, silence hung between them, fragile and electric. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to step back, but her body betrayed her, rooted by the intensity in his eyes. She remembered the diner, the first time their gazes had locked, the spark she had tried to bury beneath logic. Here in the quiet of his office, that spark felt dangerously close to flame. That evening, Alexander insisted on accompanying her out of the building. The excuse was simple security, he claimed, but Naomi sensed it was something else. The driver opened the door of the sleek black car, and Alexander gestured for her to enter first. She obeyed, sliding into the leather interior, the scent of cedar and steel filling her senses. He followed, sitting beside her, filling the confined space like gravity. The city blurred past outside, neon lights reflecting in the tinted glass. For a while, neither spoke. At last, Naomi broke the silence. Why me? You have an army of better qualified people. Lawyers, negotiators, strategists. Why choose me? His eyes turned toward her, sharp in the dim light. Because they see problems. You see people. Naomi's breath hitched. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters, he said quietly. She looked away, her fingers twisting in her lap. But his words lingered, warm and heavy, burrowing deep. When the car stopped at her apartment, Alexander stepped out first. He opened the door for her, a simple gesture so uncharacteristic of the ruthless man described in headlines that she almost forgot to breathe. Thank you, she whispered. He inclined his head, his gaze lingering on hers a fraction too long. Then he turned, disappearing back into the night. Naomi climbed the stairs to her apartment, her heart pounding. Inside, Marcus was already asleep, his nebulizer humming gently. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. She should have been thinking of strategies, contracts, and the impossibility of her situation. But all she could think of was how Alexander Whitmore had looked at her in the car, like a man who had forgotten how to feel suddenly remembering. And worse, how much she wanted him to remember. Days passed, and whispers spread through Whitmore Plaza. The waitress who had tamed a union. The outsider who had humbled Chase Montgomery. Naomi walked with her head high, but inside a storm raged. Every glance from Alexander felt weighted, every word tinged with something unsaid. She told herself it was nothing professional, respect, nothing more. But when she caught her reflection in the mirrored elevator doors, cheeks flushed from a passing word of praise, she knew she was lying to herself. This was not just work. This was not just trust. She had no name for this something she should not want, but could no longer deny. And deep down, she feared no. She knew that Alexander Whitmore felt it too. The hum of Whitmore Plaza had changed. Naomi Carter could feel it in the way conversations stilled, when she passed and the glances darted at her reflection in the glass walls, in the low notes of disbelief that rippled like a hidden current. The waitress, the outsider, the one Whitmore trusts. Every whisper was a blade, but Naomi had learned to keep her steps measured, her head high. The training ground of her life had been crowded diners and relentless shifts. The disdain of men in suits was almost gentle in comparison. And yet there was one gaze sharper than all the whispers combined, Chase Montgomery's. Chase had been born for this world. His father's name opened doors, his Ivy League pedigree sealed them. To him, power was a birthright. And Naomi's very presence, her victories at Sterling Tower and the docks, was an insult written across the marble halls. The first signs of his retaliation were minor. A file was misplaced here, and a meeting invitation was arriving late. Documents she needed seemed to vanish from shared servers. Her words were twisted, misquoted in executive briefings. Subtle sabotage, the kind that might have unraveled anyone less meticulous. But Naomi had lived too long with chaos to stumble over it now. She double-checked every calendar, kept copies of documents, and sent summary emails after every conversation. The diner had taught her survival. The plaza merely gave it a different uniform. Still, its weight pressed against her ribs. One evening, long after most lights in the tower had dimmed, Naomi lingered in her glass-walled office. Her desk lamp cast a soft halo over papers she was too weary to read. She pressed her palms to her eyes, fighting the ache of exhaustion. A knock sounded against the doorframe. She looked up. Alexander stood there, his figure tall and austere. Tie loosened his silver hair, shadowed in the muted light. "You're still here," he observed. "So are you," she countered, though her voice was gentler than her words. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The world outside was muted, leaving only the hush of their breaths. "Montgomery," he said at last, as though the name itself were a distaste. "He's trying to break you." Naomi stiffened. "I can handle him." His eyes, gray unyielding, searched her face. "Should you have to?" Her chest tightened. "In your world, yes. If I can't, I don't belong here." The silence stretched heavy and charged. Then softly, "You belong more than most." The words slipped past his guarded exterior, like something he hadn't meant to reveal. Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked away, heart drumming. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander moved closer, stopping just at the edge of propriety. His presence was a storm, contained a tide she both feared and longed to step into. "Do not thank me," he said, voice low. Just do not let him win. Their eyes held hers wide with the danger of feeling his shadowed with something she could not name. For one reckless second, she thought he might touch her, his hand lifting as though against his own restraint. But then he stepped back, the mask sliding into place once more. "Go home, Naomi," he said, his voice clipped again. "Rest. Tomorrow will demand all of you." And he was gone, leaving her heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. The following week, her strength was tested again. Alexander summoned her into a meeting where executives debated the Finch Foundation's No Whitmore Foundation's next philanthropic partner. Brochures lined the table, glossy pages, promising progress and hope. The favored candidate, Future Path Foundation, dazzled with endorsements and photographs of smiling children. Chase Montgomery championed it with polished fervor. They're media-savvy, well-connected, precise, and the kind of partner who elevates our image. Naomi flipped through the brochure. Something itched at her instincts. The photos were too curated, and the words were too vague. She had seen this kind of surface shine before customers in the diner who smiled too brightly, while their hands trembled over unpaid checks. "I want to do a deeper review," she said carefully. "Not just the brochures. Site visits. Talking to the people they claim to serve." Chase's smile was sharp. "With respect, Miss Carter, we have analysts for that. Your talents are better suited elsewhere." The slight was deliberate, cruel. Naomi braced herself, but Alexander's voice cut through, calm and commanding. "Let her review," he said. "If Carter sees something, I want to know it." The room fell silent. Chase's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Naomi kept her expression neutral, though her pulse leapt. Once again, Alexander had stood between her and the storm. But was it only faith in her instincts, or something more dangerous? Over the next week, Naomi visited community centers that Future Path claimed to fund. The reality she found was bleak, peeling walls, empty shelves, programs that existed only on glossy paper. Volunteers spoke of promises never kept, of money vanishing into distant offices. Each discovery tightened the knot in her chest. She had to be careful, meticulous. If she faltered, Chase would bury her. But as she worked late into the night, the memory of Alexander's voice, "Let her review," anchored her. And each morning when she stepped into Whitmore Plaza, his gaze would meet hers across the boardroom. Brief, unreadable, yet grounding. After one such long day, she found herself again in the black car, Alexander beside her. He had offered a ride, a simple courtesy, or so he called it. But the silence between them was thick with something neither dared to name. The city lights blurred past neon, spilling across his profile. Naomi found herself watching the hard line of his jaw, how fatigue softened his expression when he thought no one looked. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked suddenly. His eyes shifted to hers. "Of what?" "Of carrying the world like it's yours to hold." A shadow of something pain perhaps crossed his face. "I don't carry it because I want to. I have it because someone else will drop it if I don't." Naomi's throat tightened. She saw not the ruthless billionaire of headlines for a moment, but a man weary of his armor. Without thinking, she whispered, "You don't have to carry it alone." The words hung in the air, fragile, intimate. His gaze burned into hers, and she felt the car fade away, leaving only the electric space between them. But then he looked away, jaw tightening once more. "Be careful with promises, Naomi. They bind more than contracts." Her heart stuttered. She turned to the window, but her reflection betrayed her, a flush in her cheeks, a longing she couldn't disguise. By the end of that week, she delivered her findings on Future Path. Facts, inflated salaries, empty programs, funds funneled to shell companies. At the bottom of her report was one more discovery: a boutique PR firm receiving the largest payments. Its owner is Caroline Vance Chase Montgomery's partner. The boardroom was a battlefield when she presented. Chase's mask cracked, outrage spilling. He accused her of fabrication of personal vendetta. But Naomi's evidence was undeniable. And as the executives whispered, Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her, not on the chaos. Calm, steady. And in that silence, Naomi understood something she hadn't before. She was no longer just solving his problems. She was standing at his side. That night, she returned home drained but restless. Marcus was already asleep, his small chest rising and falling to the rhythm of his treatment. Naomi kissed his forehead, then stood by the window, staring out at the city that seemed suddenly both immense and within reach. Her reflection wavered against the glass, her eyes bright with something new. Not just exhaustion, not just resolve, but a fire had been lit by a man who had once seemed untouchable. And as she touched the glass, imagining the towers of Whitmore Plaza, beyond the horizon, she whispered to herself, words she dared not speak aloud. He sees me. The thought was terrifying. The idea was thrilling. And somewhere high above, in his fortress of glass, Alexander Whitmore stared out his window, the echo of Naomi Carter's voice lingering in his mind, like a melody he had no business remembering. The storm came quietly, as storms often do in Alexander Whitmore's world. It began with whispers, not the kind that clung to Naomi in the glass hallways of Whitmore Plaza, but darker, sharper, calculated murmurs meant to wound. She felt them before she heard them, like cold drafts curling through invisible cracks. Chase Montgomery had not forgotten his humiliation. Each victory Naomi carved for herself, first with Eleanor Brooks, then with Tony Russo, and finally the public unmasking of future path, was salt ground into his pride. He had tried sabotage and failed. Now he turned to something else, something more dangerous. Naomi sensed the shift in the air, but could not place it. Documents no longer went missing. Meetings arrived on time. On the surface, Chase was courteous, even polished. But the precision of his new behavior unsettled her more than his open disdain ever had. He smiled too easily, his greetings too smooth. It was the calm of a predator who had found another way to strike. She poured her energy into work, refusing to flinch. The Foundation's new direction demanded her focus, and Alexander's trust was a weight she could not afford to betray. Yet at night, as Marcus slept and the city pulsed beyond her window, unease coiled through her chest. Something was coming. And then it arrived. Chase hired Grant, a private investigator, whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his ruthlessness. His task was simple: find something on Naomi Carter, anything. For weeks, the investigator combed through records, finances, and neighborhoods Naomi had long left behind. At first, he found nothing. Naomi's life was brutally honest. Late bills, endless shifts, sacrifices carved from her body. No scandals, no secrets. Until he went back to the beginning, to the robbery at Harlem Corner Diner. A month after the incident, one of the men was arrested and caught trying to spend a marked bill. Daniel Sullivan was a low-level criminal with a trail of petty thefts behind him. And Daniel, Grant discovered, had a brother, Michael Sullivan, a junior analyst, on the 62nd floor of Whitmore Plaza, working under Chase Montgomery. When Chase heard the name, his blood ran cold. He remembered the slight, almost laughable discrepancy that had crossed his desk months before. $5,000 misallocated, a flagged report. Michael had pleaded a family emergency. Eager to push a deal through, Chase buried it with his signature. Days later, that money had been wired to Daniel's girlfriend. Days later, Daniel had walked into Naomi's diner with a gun. It should have been a coincidence, but in the cruel arithmetic of power, it was not. Chase saw the danger instantly. If anyone traced the lines, it would not be Naomi who burned it, would be him. So he did what men like him always do. He sharpened the truth into a weapon and aimed it away from himself. Naomi first felt the blow in the shape of silence. Colleagues who reluctantly began to respect her now watched with guarded eyes. Conversations died when she entered the break room. A shadow had passed over her reputation, invisible but suffocating. Beth, her friend at the diner, warned her first. One evening, Beth called in a rush of words, "Naomi, someone came asking about you. Some investigators said it was about the robbery. Be careful." Naomi's stomach dropped. The robbery. It was supposed to be behind her. She thought of the gunman's eyes, wild and shaking of the fear that had clawed her throat. She thought of Alexander watching her then with something like awe, and she thought of the card he had left that had pulled her into this world. What would happen if the robbery followed her into Whitmore Plaza? The answer came faster than she expected. Alexander called her into his office late one evening. The skyline glowed behind him, lights flickering against the glass. He did not sit at his desk, but stood near the window, his back straight, his presence unreadable. "Naomi," he said, and even her name on his lips felt different, weighted, deliberate. "There's something I need to ask you." Her pulse stumbled. "What is it?" He turned his gray eyes sharper than she had ever seen them. "The robbery. The man with the gun. His name was Daniel Sullivan. Does it mean anything to you?" The room spun. Her breath caught. "No. I didn't know his name until after." "Why?" "Because his brother Alexander said slowly, 'I work here in my company.'" Shock cracked through her chest. She shook her head. "That can't be." "It is," he said. "Michael Sullivan, an analyst under Montgomery." His voice darkened. "And Montgomery once buried an audit that flagged him." The silence between them stretched suffocating. Naomi's throat ached. "Did I have something to do with this?" "No." The word came sharp, immediate, almost fierce. He stepped closer, his eyes unblinking. "I don't. But others will. And that is the danger." Her knees threatened to give. She reached for the back of the chair, grounding herself. "What happens now?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Now we find the truth before they turn it into a noose." That night, Naomi walked home through the city streets with her chest hollowed out. The world that had seemed newly possible, a horizon she could almost touch now, tilted beneath her feet. She thought of Marcus, the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, and the life she had clawed to protect. And she thought of Alexander, of the way he had said no without hesitation, and his eyes had burned not with suspicion, but with something fiercer. Belief. Yet belief was fragile in a world built on reputation. And she could not bear the thought of being the weakness that fractured his empire. Meanwhile, Chase sharpened his blade. He pressed the connection in whispers, letting it slither through the plaza. The waitress wasn't a coincidence. She was entangled. How else does a billionaire pluck her from obscurity? But Naomi did not crumble. She gathered evidence with the same steady grace she had once used to carry plates through chaos. She traced payment trails and cross-referenced reports. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not of her guilt, but of Chase's. Future Path had not been his only indiscretion. Caroline Vance's PR firm was only the beginning. The Sullivan signature, the buried audit, they all led back to him. Still, the walls pressed closer. Each day the stairs grew colder. Each meeting felt like walking a tightrope above knives. And through it all, Alexander watched. He never said the words, but she felt them in his gaze. He believed in her, not just in her innocence, but in her strength. He trusted her to weather the storm, and that dangerous, intoxicating trust lit a fire in her chest. One evening long after midnight, Naomi sat in her office alone. Papers were spread before her, evidence taking shape. She had what she needed to expose Chase, but exhaustion pressed against her skull, and for the first time in weeks, her composure cracked. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her face, fighting back tears she refused to shed. She had carried too much for too long. The door opened softly. She lifted her head. Alexander stood there, his coat draped over his arm, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you," he answered. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, he looked at her, at the woman who had turned his empire on its head, who had faced a gun and never wavered, who now sat trembling, yet unbroken. Without a word, he set his coat over her shoulders. The fabric was warm, carrying his scent, sharp and steady. Naomi's throat tightened. "Alexander," she began, but her voice broke. He crouched before her chair, his eyes level with hers. His hand hovered above hers, not quite touching, restrained by the gulf between them. He said quietly that they would come for you because you threatened the order they built. But I will not let them break you. Her tears burned. Why? Why? Risk it. His gaze held hers, and something raw flickered through his mask in that silence. Because you remind me of what it means to believe in someone. Because when you stand in a storm, you make me think I can too. The words pierced deeper than any vow. Naomi's breath shook. Her heart thundered. And for one reckless heartbeat, she wished he would close the distance, take her trembling hand in his, and confess the truth that already burned between them. But he didn't. He rose his walls, snapping back into place. "Rest. Naomi," he said, his voice firm again. "Tomorrow, we end in Montgomery." And then he was gone, leaving her wrapped in his coat, her heart unraveling beneath its weight. She stayed there long after, staring at the city lights beyond the glass. Her hands clutched the fabric, her skin tingling where his presence had lingered. She knew the storm was not over. Chase Montgomery would not fall quietly. But for the first time since the diner, Naomi was not afraid, because she was no longer standing alone. The morning of the confrontation arrived like a storm cloud rolling over the city. From the window of her small apartment, Naomi Carter could see Manhattan glinting in the distance, towers catching the fragile light of dawn. It should have inspired awe, but today it felt like a battlefield. She had not slept. Evidence lay scattered across her table, printouts, ledgers, cross-referenced files. Each page was a weapon forged in long nights of doubt and determination. The lines were clear now. Michael Sullivan's misappropriations, Chase Montgomery's buried audit, the tangled threads that connected them to Daniel Sullivan and that night at the diner. In addition, false charities were funneled to Caroline Vance's firm. It was enough. Enough to bring him down. Sufficient to prove she did not belong to the shadows. And yet, as Naomi buttoned her blouse and straightened her jacket, her hands shook. Not from fear of Chase. He was already crumbling beneath the weight of his own deceit, but from the knowledge that today she would stand exposed before the man who had seen her in ways no one else had. Alexander Whitmore. The thought of him steadied her and unsettled her in equal measure. He had trusted her and shielded her when whispers grew sharp. He had draped his coat over her shoulders when she faltered, a gesture so intimate she still felt the echo of his warmth. But trust was fragile in his world. If she stumbled, it would fracture. If she failed, she would not only lose him, she would lose the fragile belief he had gifted her that she belonged. Whitmore Plaza was alive with anticipation. Rumors of an emergency board meeting had rippled through the upper floors like electricity. Executives filed toward the vast boardroom, their eyes curious, some wary, many skeptical. Naomi walked among them with measured steps, her folder clutched like a shield. Inside the boardroom, stretched wide and cold, a cathedral of power. At its head sat Alexander, tall and composed, his expression carved from stone. His gaze flicked briefly to her as she entered, the slightest acknowledgement that reached deeper than words. Chase Montgomery was already there, immaculate in a dark suit, his smile sharp as glass. His confidence was brittle, but he wore it like armor. When his eyes met Naomi's, she saw not triumph, but desperation, veiled in arrogance. The meeting began, with Alexander's voice low and steady. "We are here because questions have been raised about the integrity of our philanthropic partnerships. Miss Carter has prepared findings. She will present them now." All eyes turned to her. Naomi's heart hammered, but her voice, when it came, was clear. She began with Future Path, its glossy brochures, hollow programs, the trail of money vanishing into shell companies. She laid out figures, testimonies, and photographs of empty classrooms where children were promised help that never came. Then she turned the page. She said the largest beneficiary of Future Path's funds, her gaze steady, is a boutique public relations firm, owned by Caroline Vance, partner to Chase Montgomery. The room rippled with murmurs. Chase's mask faltered, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to protest, but Naomi pressed on. "This is not an isolated issue. It is part of a pattern." Months before the diner robbery, Michael Sullivan, an analyst in this company, was flagged for financial discrepancies. The supervising executive, Mr. Montgomery, cleared the report. 2 days later, $5,000 was wired to Daniel Sullivan. Daniel then used those funds in part to stage the armed robbery at Harlem Corner Diner. A sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Naomi's voice did not waver. "I am not suggesting Mr. Montgomery orchestrated that crime, but his ambition led him to ignore a serious breach. His negligence tied this company, however indirectly, to violence that nearly cost lives. He concealed this while advancing a fraudulent charity that funneled money into his pocket." She set the folder down, her hands steady at last. "In short, Mr. Montgomery has become the single most significant risk on the 88th floor." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Alexander's gaze moved across the table, landing on Chase. His voice was deceptively soft. "Is there anything in this presentation that is factually inaccurate?" Chase's confidence cracked. His lips parted, words stumbling. It's complicated. No." Alexander cut him off, his voice dropping into a growl. "It is straightforward. Get your things. Security will escort you out. Your career here is over." The blow landed like thunder. Chase's face drained of color, his eyes wild as he looked around the room, seeking a lifeline that did not exist. Finally, with a strangled sound, he rose. The guards at the door stepped forward. The golden boy of Whitmore Plaza walked out, not with dignity, but with the hollow echo of defeat trailing behind him. The boardroom remained hushed, stunned by the spectacle. But Naomi barely saw them. Her eyes were on Alexander. He looked at her, not with the cold detachment of a CEO, but with something deeper, something that struck straight through her. Pride, yes. Respect, undeniably. But beneath that, she had begun to recognize a glimmer of emotion, a warmth too dangerous to name. "Miss Carter," he said, finally, his voice carrying across the silence. "You did not just identify a problem. You brought proof and a solution. The position of president of the Whitmore Foundation is open. It is yours, if you will take it." Her breath caught. The words hung in the air like a promise, like a door opening onto a world she had never dared imagine. She should have felt only triumph. Yet all she could think of was how he looked at her, as though this moment belonged not to the company, but to them. Later that evening, the city was still buzzing with the news. Chase Montgomery's fall was already fodder for headlines, though the details remained locked behind Whitmore Plaza's doors. Naomi sat alone in her new office, the view sprawling beneath her like a dream. She should have been celebrating. Instead, she felt hollowed out by the weight of everything that had passed. A soft knock drew her from her thoughts. She looked up, and there he was. Alexander stepped inside without waiting for permission, as though boundaries no longer applied between them. He closed the door, and the world beyond faded. "You carried the day," he said. "I only told the truth," Naomi whispered. "Truth is the rarest weapon," he replied. His eyes searched hers unguarded for once. "And you wielded it flawlessly." Her chest tightened. The air between them seemed charged, as though every unsaid word, every glance, every moment of quiet trust had been building to this. "Alexander." Her voice trembled. "Why do you keep standing by me? Why risk your reputation for me?" His jaw clenched, his mask slipping. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood barely a breath away. "Because," he said softly, "the night I watched you face down a gun, I realized something. You don't just manage crises. You carry people through them. You took me, Naomi. You reminded me I was still alive." Her breath caught her heart pounding so loudly she thought he must hear it. He lifted a hand, hesitated, then brushed his fingers lightly against her cheek. The touch was tentative, reverent, as though she were something fragile he was afraid to break. Naomi closed her eyes, leaning into it despite herself. There was no billionaire server or empire between them for one suspended moment. Only two people were bound by a truth they could no longer deny. When she opened her eyes, his were burning. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "So is everything worth having," she whispered back. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of longing, fear, and the fragile beginnings of something that could unravel them both. He stepped back first, his hand falling away, his walls snapping back into place. But the crack had been made, and neither could pretend it wasn't there. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady again, "the world will ask questions. About the foundation, about you. Be ready." Naomi nodded, though her body still hummed from his touch. "I will." He lingered a heartbeat longer, torn between duty and desire, before finally leaving. The door closed behind him, but the air remained electric heavy with what had almost been. Naomi sat back, pressing a trembling hand to her cheek where his fingers had lingered. The city sprawled beneath her window, vast and unyielding. Yet for the first time, she felt not like an outsider staring in, but like someone who belonged to its heart. And in that moment, she understood the truth she had been afraid to face. It was not just the foundation, the work, or even the chance to build something greater. It was him. And she was already lost. The story should have ended in the boardroom. Naomi had done what no one expected of her. She had dismantled Chase Montgomery's glittering facade, proved his corruption with facts so sharp they cut the air itself, and stepped into a position that once would have seemed a fantasy. President of the Whitmore Foundation. It was more than she had ever dared to imagine. But stories rarely stay where they belong, especially when they carry the spark of something irresistible. It began with Brenda. Naomi hadn't seen her since that night in Harlem Corner Diner, when Brenda's frightened sobs had nearly tipped the gunman into violence. Naomi's calm voice steadied her, pulling her back from the brink. What Naomi never knew was that Brenda had told her granddaughter every detail. The granddaughter Chloe was a journalist, hungry and unafraid to chase stories others overlooked. To her, the tale of a waitress who calmed a robbery was already compelling. But when Brenda mentioned the stranger in the corner booth, the man who had left a tip that looked more like a fortune, Chloe's instincts sharpened. She dug. A name remembered, a business card glimpsed a diner owner willing to confirm. Within days, she had it: Alexander Whitmore. The titan, the recluse. The man rarely allowed his name to be on financial pages. And the waitress he had left behind with $2,000 and a door into his world. The first article was small, almost sweet. Billionaire's enormous tip to hero. Waitress after robbery. A feel-good story meant to brighten timelines for an evening. But stories have a way of growing teeth when the world tastes blood. Chloe kept digging. She found city records, the dedication of the Brooks Memorial Garden, interviews with Eleanor herself, who couldn't stop praising the bright, empathetic young woman from Whitmore Enterprises who had saved her home. Piece by piece, Chloe assembled the puzzle. Once a waitress, Naomi Carter was now a rising executive at Whitmore's empire. The headline changed from waitress to president, the woman who caught Whitmore's eye, and the world erupted. Naomi first realized something had shifted when Beth from the diner called, her voice breathless. "Girl, you're on the news." "What?" Naomi blinked, still groggy from a night spent reviewing grant proposals. "Turn on the TV. Now." Naomi did. And there she was, her photograph beside Alexander's. The Chiron screaming, the waitress and the billionaire. A modern fairy tale. Her stomach dropped. The segment spun the story into something it wasn't. Or maybe something it was becoming: a tale of rescue and reinvention. Of a man's wealth meeting a woman's grace. They spoke of her composure in the robbery, his fabled ruthlessness softened by her presence, their unlikely bond now thrust into the light. Naomi turned off the screen, her hands trembling. The air in her apartment felt too small, too sharp. Marcus stirred in the next room, his voice rasping. "Naomi, what's wrong?" "Nothing, baby," she lied, smoothing his curls. "Go back to sleep." But nothing had ever felt less accurate. At Whitmore Plaza, the atmosphere crackled. Cameras gathered at the entrance. Executives whispered not about her competence this time, but about the story. The story, the thing that had escaped their control and was now shaping reputations on a global stage. When Naomi stepped into her office, she found Alexander waiting. He stood near the window as always, but his posture was different. Tense, taut, as if he were containing a storm. "You've seen it," he said. Not a question. "Yes." Her voice was small. He turned, and his eyes pinned her in place. "The world thinks it has discovered us." Naomi's throat tightened. "Us." His jaw clenched, a flicker of something raw in his expression. "Do not play coy, Naomi. They will not see a foundation president. They will know a waitress lifted by a man's interest. They will see a scandal. They will see weakness." The words struck, but beneath them, she heard something else. Fear not for himself, but for her. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "I know," he said. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw the man beneath, the man who had once sat alone in a diner with cold eggs and colder thoughts, who had watched her face down death and felt something awaken in his chest. "I can control markets," he said softly. "I can silence rivals. But I cannot control this. The story has its own gravity." Her heart pounded. Then what do we do? His eyes darkened. We face it. Together. The last word lingered in the air like a vow. Naomi's breath caught, and the world's noise faded in that fragile second. There was only him, only the promise, buried in his gaze. But promises are not shields. By the next morning, Naomi's face was everywhere online. Headlines, glossy magazine sites, even morning talk shows spinning her story into a romance the world wanted to consume. The photographs chosen were cruel in contrast. Her in her waitress uniform beside Alexander, in tailored suits, her modest smile beside his hard, sculpted face. Fairy tale, they called it. Cinderella, some whispered. Naomi hated it. She had fought for every inch of ground beneath her feet. She was not lifted by a man's whim, but by strength, and yet the narrative drowned her voice. At the foundation, donors called with curiosity, journalists begged for interviews. Colleagues looked at her with a mix of envy and disdain. She carried herself with dignity, but at night alone the weight pressed harder. It was Alexander who broke the silence. He appeared in her office one evening after the day's endless storm of calls. He closed the door and leaned against it, watching her as though memorizing the exhaustion etched into her posture. "They want an interview," he said. Naomi stiffened. "With me?" "Yes." He crossed the room, each step deliberate. "And I intend for you to give it." Her head snapped up. Why to feed their narrative? His gaze softened the steel in him, giving way to something gentler, to rewrite it. Naomi's breath caught. "They will tell this story with or without us." He continued. "Better it be your voice they hear. Better they see not a rescued waitress, but the woman who commands my foundation. The woman who commands herself." Her chest tightened. "And what will they see of you?" For the first time, Alexander allowed a small, almost rueful smile. "Perhaps something I no longer mind them seeing." Naomi's heart stuttered. The air between them felt charged, alive with all the words neither dared speak. She swallowed hard. "If I do this, if I stand before them, you will not stand alone," he said. His voice was low, steady, a promise carved from stone. The interview was scheduled for the following week. Naomi spent nights preparing not for questions of charity or finance, but for the insinuations she knew would come. She practiced answers in the mirror, calming her voice when her heart raced. On the day she walked into the studio with her head high, dressed in a dark suit, alone, with no borrowed image or disguise. Cameras flashed, lights burned, and the world leaned closer. Naomi answered with clarity when the questions came about the robbery, Alexander's tip, and her rise from waitress to president. She did not let them paint her as saved. She told them she had been strong long before anyone noticed. What Alexander saw was not fragility, but the muscle forged in hardship, caring for her brother, and carrying burdens others could not. And when asked about Alexander himself, she did not falter. She said, "Mr. Whitmore did not give me a position out of charity." Her voice was calm, steady, her gaze direct. "He recognized a skill, the same skills I used in that diner. Calm, clear judgment, empathy under fire are the ones I use to guide the foundation now. This is not a fairy tale. This is reality, and reality is built on work." The word struck. Headlines shifted the narrative bent, and somewhere watching from the shadows of the studio, Alexander's eyes never left her. That night back in her office, Naomi found him waiting. He stood by her window, the city glowing beneath him like a crown of fire. "You did more than answer them," he said softly when she entered. "You silenced them." Naomi set her bag down, her heart pounding. "I only told the truth. And that," he murmured, stepping closer, "is what terrifies them." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of the day pressing against the fragile thread between them. Naomi wanted to speak to tell him how much his belief had steadied her, how much she feared what was growing between them, and yet could not bear to sever it. But when she looked up, his gaze was already there, fierce and unyielding, as though he had been holding back his own words. "Naomi." His voice broke just slightly. "This cannot." She cut him off with a whisper. "Then why does it feel like it already has?" The silence burned. His hand lifted, hovered as though to touch her, then fell back. Because he said finally, his tone was raw, "And the world may believe this is a fairy tale. But for me, it is the most dangerous truth I've ever lived." Her breath shook. She wanted to reach for him to close the impossible distance, but he stepped back, his walls slamming shut. "Go home," he said softly. "Rest. Tomorrow, the world will come knocking again." Naomi obeyed, but as she left, her heart carried the weight of his unspoken confession. And high above Manhattan, Alexander Whitmore stood alone, staring at the city lights, knowing the truth he could not yet speak. Naomi Carter had stolen his heart by saving her place in his world. The world had shifted on its axis. Naomi Carter had stepped out of the shadows and into the global light, and though the narrative threatened to swallow her whole, she had bent it toward truth. Her interview had been replayed across networks, quoted in newspapers, and shared endlessly online. And through it all, Alexander Whitmore watched her with a quiet intensity that was no longer that of a man merely testing his protege. He watched her like a man who had discovered something far rarer than power. But while the world admired, one man seethed. Chase Montgomery was gone from Whitmore Plaza, escorted out with disgrace, his empire of connections fractured. But exile is not silence. Humiliation can be a sharper blade than ambition. Chase stood before a bar cart in his penthouse on the Upper East Side, pouring whiskey with hands that trembled with fury. He had lost his throne, prestige, and place in the empire, and in the void left behind, only Naomi's face remained. The waitress, the woman he had dismissed with sarcasm and cruelty. She had not only survived him, she had destroyed him. He threw back the drink, but the burn in his throat did not match the fire in his chest. He would not let it end this way. Meanwhile, in the soaring glass tower of Whitmore Plaza, Naomi walked through the foundation's halls with quiet resolve. The work was overwhelming: interviews, partnerships, initiatives, blooming beneath her stewardship. But it was not the work that kept her awake at night. It was him. Alexander had been more present and protective since the interview. But his distance grew sharper, like a line he dared not cross. Their conversations carried an undercurrent of longing, hidden beneath the veneer of professionalism. A glance that lingered too long, a silence that said more than words, a hesitation at the threshold of something they both feared and craved. Naomi told herself it was impossible, that men like him did not fall for women like her, that her role, her dignity demanded boundaries. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she still felt the ghost of his hand against her cheek, the warmth of his coat on her shoulders, the way his gaze softened only for her. The first sign of Chase's revenge came as a whisper tucked inside a headline. Montgomery claims foul play in foundation promotion. It was a minor article, a half-page in a business column, but its words were venomous. Anonymous sources suggested Naomi's promotion had been personal, that her relationship with Alexander was inappropriate, that she had risen not by merit, but by proximity. Naomi read it with her stomach sinking. She knew the source without needing confirmation. That evening, she stormed into Alexander's office, the newspaper trembling. "This is him," she said, her voice tight. "He won't stop." Alexander took the paper, scanning it with a face carved from steel. His silence stretched until she feared he might believe it. But then he folded the page with deliberate calm, and set it aside. His eyes met hers, sharp and steady. "Let him shout from the ashes of his ruin," Alexander said. "The world already saw you stand on your own. They won't believe him." Naomi's throat tightened. "But what if they do? What if it destroys everything we've built?" His gaze softened just slightly. "Then we build again." The words, fierce and straightforward, made her chest ache. She looked at him, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw not just the billionaire, not just the strategist, but the man who had begun to tether his fate to hers. Still, Chase was relentless. Anonymous tips flooded journalists' inboxes. Old photographs of Naomi in her waitress uniform surfaced, accompanied by captions dripping with condescension. Online forums speculated wildly about her relationship with Alexander, dissecting every glance from the interview, every rumor. The scrutiny was suffocating. Naomi held herself with dignity, but inside, the weight pressed harder each day. At night, she lay awake, Marcus asleep in the next room, and wondered if she had dragged him into a storm she could not control. It was during one such night that her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You don't belong in his world. Leave now before you regret it." Her breath caught. She knew the voice behind the silence. Chase. The next morning, she walked into Alexander's office, her resolve steel, despite the tremor in her hands. She handed him the phone. He read the message, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening into a storm. "Montgomery," he muttered, his voice like thunder beneath the surface. Naomi swallowed. "He won't stop until he ruins me. Until he ruins us." The word slipped out before she could catch it. Us. Alexander looked up sharply. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was taut, fragile. Finally, his voice dropped low and raw. "He won't ruin us." Her heart stuttered. "You believe that?" she whispered. "I promise it." And for the first time, she believed promises could be stronger than contracts. Days later, the confrontation became inevitable. Chase's campaign escalated. He leaked internal memos, twisted out of context, spread whispers of financial impropriety in the foundation, and insinuated that Naomi was his puppet. It culminated in a shareholder meeting, where to Naomi's shock, Chase appeared uninvited, accompanied by lawyers and reporters. He strode into the room with the arrogance of a man who believed himself resurrected. "This company," he declared, "has been compromised. Its leadership is compromised. Are we to entrust Whitmore's legacy to a server plucked from obscurity because she caught his eye?" Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. The sting of the word waitress cracked through Naomi's chest. She opened her mouth, but Alexander's voice thundered first. "Enough!" The room was silent. Alexander rose from his seat, his figure imposing his presence undeniable. "You speak of legacy, Montgomery." His voice cut like a blade. "Legacy is not inherited through birthright. It is forged, and Miss Carter has forged hers in ways you cannot fathom." Chase sneered. Forged or favored? Alexander's gaze hardened. He turned, looking at Naomi before the room, and something shifted in his eyes. "She was not favored," he said. "She was chosen. Because in the face of a gun, she showed more composure than men twice her age. Because in negotiations where you failed, she triumphed. Because she sees what others overlook, people. And that is the rarest skill of all." The silence was electric. Naomi's heart pounded not just from his defense, but from the word unspoken beneath his voice. "Because she is the one I believe in. Because she is the one I—" Chase faltered, his arrogance fraying under the weight of Alexander's words. The reporters scribbled, the shareholders whispered. At that moment, it was clear that Chase had lost his position, and he also narrated the story itself. After the meeting, Naomi found herself alone in the corridor outside. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest, her breath shallow. His words replayed in her mind, each a confession hidden in plain sight. She heard footsteps. Alexander appeared, his expression softer now, the storm in his eyes giving way to something gentler. "You shouldn't have had to endure that," he said quietly. Naomi lifted her gaze. "You defended me before everyone. I only told the truth." Her throat tightened. "But why? Why risk so much for me?" He hesitated. For once, Alexander Whitmore, the man who never faltered, revealed, or bowed, looked uncertain. And then, as if the dam had cracked, he whispered, "Because I can lose towers, deals, and everything. But I cannot lose you." The world tilted. Naomi's breath caught her pulse, a wild rush in her veins. "Alexander." Her voice was a tremor, half fear, half longing. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate. This time he did not stop. His fingers brushed her cheek, warm, grounding, reverent. "You are my most significant risk," he said, his voice breaking, "and the only one I want to take." Naomi closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her heart unraveling. For the first time, she did not resist the truth growing between them since the diner. It was not just trust, not just respect. It was love, dangerous, impossible, undeniable. That night, Naomi stood by her apartment window, the city lights glittering like stars scattered across the ground. Marcus slept peacefully, his breath steady. But Naomi could not sleep. Her heart was too whole, too fragile, too alive. Alexander stood by his window somewhere across the city, staring into the night. He had built walls higher than his towers, fortresses of steel and silence for years. But now, one woman had walked through the fire of his life and lit it anew. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a dangerous, impossible hope for the first time in years. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in every corner of Naomi Carter's life. Chase Montgomery was gone for good, stripped of power, and the illusion that had carried him for so long. The headlines had shifted, no longer about scandal or suspicion. Still about Naomi herself, the woman who had faced down robbers, silenced corruption, and against all odds, risen to command the Whitmore Foundation. But while the world celebrated her, Naomi's heart lived in quieter battles. Because beneath every triumph headline and boardroom victory, there was the truth she and Alexander carried between them, unspoken yet burning. It began in his office above the city, as so many moments did. The skyline glittered in the dusk, the Hudson painted gold by a fading sun. Naomi stood by the window, her reflection caught in the glass, while Alexander sat at his desk, papers spread before him like battle maps. "You've changed things," he said at last, breaking the silence. His voice was low, contemplative. Naomi turned. The foundation needed change. He shook his head, eyes meeting hers. "Not just the foundation. Me." Her breath caught. The air between them felt charged, too full for such a small space. For months, they had danced along the edge of confession, too aware of the consequences, too afraid of the gravity. But now his walls seemed thinner, his gaze raw. "Alexander," she whispered. He rose from his chair, crossing the room with measured steps. When he stopped before her, the city sprawled beneath them like a secret they alone shared. "You've shown me more than strategy, Naomi, more than strength. You've shown me a world I forgot existed." His hand lifted hesitant, only for a second, before his fingers brushed against hers, a world where trust, hope, and his voice faltered, rare vulnerability threading through. "And love still matters." Naomi's heart thundered. She wanted to pull away to shield herself with logic, but her soul betrayed her. She stepped closer. "You're not the only one," she said softly. "I've tried to fight it, but from that night in the diner, I knew something had changed. You saw me when no one else did, and I've been seeing you ever since." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had feared to say, everything they had carried in glances and half-breaths. Then slowly, Alexander lowered his head, and Naomi rose to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that was not hurried, but deliberate, as though sealing a contract written long before either had realized. His hand cupped her cheek, steady, reverent, while her fingers gripped the lapel of his suit, grounding herself in the man who had once been untouchable. Her breath was ragged when they parted, his forehead resting against hers. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "So is living without it," she replied. The days that followed were different. Their work continued professional and precise, but now every glance carried an undercurrent of truth. Late nights in the Foundation's offices blurred into conversations beyond numbers about Marcus Isabella and the fragile ways both had learned to survive. Naomi told him of her brother's illness, of nights spent counting every dollar, every pill, every breath. Alexander told her of the silence that had haunted him after his wife's death, of how success had filled rooms, but not the hollowness inside. In those confessions, they found not weakness, but strength. Their love did not remain hidden for long. The world that had once speculated now found evidence, subtle but undeniable, a photograph of them leaving the plaza together, his hand at the small of her back, a sighting at a quiet jazz club downtown, the rare unguarded smile on Alexander's face when Naomi stood beside him at a Foundation gala. Headlines bloomed again: "The Billionaire and the Woman Who Stole His Heart." This time, Naomi did not flinch. She had faced robberies, sabotage, and the cruelty of whispers. What was love if not another storm worth weathering? And Alexander, once the fortress of Manhattan, no longer denied it. When reporters asked, his only answer was a steady gaze and 4 simple words: "She is with me." However, the most significant change came not in boardrooms or headlines, but in a small hospital room, where Marcus began a new clinical trial, funded directly by the Foundation. Naomi sat by his side, holding his hand, watching him laugh through a mask of tubes and treatments. "You're smiling?" Marcus teased, his voice raspy but light. "Am I?" Naomi laughed softly. "Yeah, you don't do that as much anymore, not like this." He tilted his head, studying her with the uncanny wisdom only children seem to carry. "It's him, Mr. Whitmore." Naomi's heart swelled. She brushed his curls back gently. "It's us, Marcus. You, me, and maybe him, too." The boy grinned, his eyes shining. "Good. You deserve someone who sees you." Tears pricked her eyes, but she only squeezed his hand tighter. Months later, the Whitmore Foundation unveiled its most ambitious project, yet Project Nightingale, a scholarship and support initiative for students from low-income backgrounds who had left nursing or medical programs due to hardship. Naomi stood on stage at the launch, her voice steady as she spoke of hidden potential, of resilience forged in fire. Behind her sat Alexander, his eyes fixed on her with quiet pride. "This isn't a fairy tale," Naomi said to the crowd. "It's proof that strength lives in unexpected places. Sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest burdens can lift others. All they need is someone to believe in them." Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. But Naomi's eyes sought only his. And in his gaze, she found everything she needed: faith, respect, love. That evening after the gala, Naomi stood with Alexander on the rooftop of Whitmore Plaza. The city stretched endlessly beneath them, lights glittering like scattered diamonds. "You've remade this place," he said quietly. Not just the foundation. Not just me. Everything. Naomi smiled, her hand slipping into his. We could remake it together. He looked at her, then his eyes softening, his mask gone. You've given me something I thought I'd buried with her. Love, she asked gently. Hope, he answered then after a pause. And yes, love. Her breath caught. The wind curled around them, carrying the hum of the city below. But in that moment, the world was theirs alone. I love you too, she whispered. The kiss they shared then was deeper than the first, no longer tentative or restrained. It was a promise, a vow, a beginning written against the skyline, the waitress and the billionaire. The story the world thought it owned, but it was never theirs to tell. It belonged only to Naomi and Alexander, the woman who had steadied a room with her voice, and the man who had finally learned that the most actual power was not in towers of glass, but in the quiet courage of love. And as they stood together on the rooftop, the city glowing around them, their story was no longer just survival, redemption, or legacy. It was a love story, fragile, fierce, and unforgettable. If Naomi's journey moved you, if Alexander's transformation touched something in your heart, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that love can rise from the most unlikely places. And if you want to walk with them further through storm's triumphs and the quiet power of hearts found against all odds, stay close. There are always more stories waiting to be told.